The Pennsylvania Railroad was once the backbone of American industry for a century. In fact, no other network was equally important. At one point, it was not only the largest railroad and transportation enterprise in the world, but it was also the largest corporation on Earth, which is a testament to its importance in American industry. However, from that unparalleled height, it fell into obscurity and dereliction, with its mark left over not just Pennsylvania, but the entire northeastern United States. So join us as we discover the rise and fall of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Most major lines in the eastern United States started in the 1820s and early 1830s, just after the success of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in England in 1825. The original railroads of note, which would eventually become Baltimore and Ohio, Erie, and New York Central, the latter of which we already have a video on, can trace their beginnings back to the railroads made for specific needs. For example, America's first railroad, the Massachusetts Granite Railway, was only 3 miles and didn't even have trains. It was powered by horses or mules. It was made solely for the transportation of granite slabs between Quincy and the location of the construction of the Bunker Hill Monument. It was rudimentary, constructed primarily of stone, and with a gauge or width of 5 feet. Anyhow, the point is that where these other major railroads got their start operating the single-use tracks, the Pennsylvania Railroad began at a time where railroads were beginning to consolidate into larger networks. Even so, the biggest delay factor to the state's railroad was the Erie Canal, which we also have a video on. After the canal's opening, a nationwide idea took over that canals were the future of transit. It wasn't until April the 13th, 1846, that the state finally chartered the Pennsylvania Railroad to link the capital of Harrisburg with Pittsburgh, which was an efficient solution when compared to the time and resource necessary to build a canal across the entire state. The first engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad, John Edgar Thomson, crafted a route maintaining moderately gentle grades following the Susquehanna and Juniata rivers before reaching what later became Altoona, a major maintenance and terminal facility. From there, it turned towards Pittsburgh by way of Gallitzin and Johnstown. Thomson was a very influential figure in the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, designing most of the railroad's earlier routes and eventually becoming the most influential president of the company's history. The Pennsylvania Railroad's construction began in 1847 at Harrisburg, and by 1849 it had reached Lewistown. The next year, it had opened in Duncansville, which is near Altoona, and by late 1852, its original charter was completed, connecting Pittsburgh to Philadelphia after the acquisition of the Harrisburg, Portsmouth, Mount Joy, and Lancaster Railroad, as well as the use of the mainline of Public Works Philadelphia and Columbia to Columbia. The first train to make the journey did so on December the 10th, 1852, fully cementing the Pennsylvania Railroad as a player in American rail. After the completion of the original charter, the Pennsylvania Railroad had a lot of catching up to do, so you might even say that being well over a decade behind one's competitors does not bode well for one's continued existence, especially during the age before antitrust legislation. Now that the Pennsylvania Railroad had access across the state, it looked to cement itself as the sole railroad powering the state. In 1851, the Pennsylvania Railroad began constructing a cross of the Allegheny summit by use of their mountain division. As part of this route, a very unique stretch of track lies just west of Altoona. Also designed by John Edgar Thomson, it is known as the Horseshoe Curve, a U-turn in the track that's 2,375 feet long and 1,300 feet in diameter. It's on the National Register of Historic Places and has been considered a National Historic Landmark since 1966, and additionally, it became a Historic Civic Engineering Landmark in 2004. And this status is really no coincidence. Even when it opened back on February the 15th, 1854, it was immediately a signature part of the Pennsylvania Railroad's route and brought it a great deal of success. As the Pennsylvania Railroad began to cement itself as a mainstay in the state's industry, the state sold its main line of public works to the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1857. The main line was a collection of canals and railroads that were used before the solidification of the railroad. And now that the state realized that the rails were going to overshadow the canals, they turned it over to the company rather than taking on the financial burden themselves. The Pennsylvania Railroad would later use the eastern segments as an entirely self-owned route across the state, bypassing middlemen altogether. Now that it solidified itself as the main connecting artery across the state, the Pennsylvania Railroad began setting its sights beyond the state for which it was named. The company wanted to link their Pittsburgh line to Chicago and St. Louis, extending their reach into the Midwestern United States. However, while they were no longer at risk of being absorbed themselves, this was when they met their greatest rival. And before I speak on that, I need to warn you that the downfall of the Pennsylvania Railroad is something astonishing. And it's also a reminder that we need to be prepared for any challenge life brings our way. And with the new year upon us, it might be the perfect opportunity to tackle those essential financial tasks. One of those tasks on my list is securing the right life insurance for my family's future. And thanks to the sponsor of this video, Policy Genius, I can honestly say that I found my peace of mind. Policy Genius makes the process seamless. Their technology allows you to compare quotes from top insurers, giving you the best possible rates. And speaking from personal experience, as a parent myself, having life insurance provides a safety net for my family. Knowing they're taken care of in unforeseen circumstances is priceless. You can easily compare quotes from top insurers, which is crucial because sometimes the coverage from work might not be enough or might not travel with you if you change your job. Their licensed agents work for you, not the insurance companies, ensuring unbiased guidance tailored to your needs. So it's no wonder they've got thousands of 5-star reviews across platforms like Google and Trustpilot. So take that step toward securing your family's future today. Save time and money and provide your financial safety net using Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/itshistory or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. On all counts, the downfall of the Pennsylvania Railroad began with the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad. Well, we already have a video covering this topic. It's worth taking a moment to explain Vanderbilt's railroad empire. For starters, while the Pennsylvania Railroad had only made a few acquisitions and built most of its track itself, New York Central was born from the unification of several smaller railroads in New York State. To name a few, it included tracks from the Albany-Schenectady Railroad, Utica and Schenectady, Syracuse and Utica, Auburn and Syracuse, Buffalo and Rochester, Schenectady and Troy, Rochester, Lockport, and Niagara Falls, just to name a few. Over 26 years, these railroads gradually consolidated into one enormous network, finally taking shape as the New York Central Railroad on May 17, 1853. Only 4 years after the Pennsylvania had acquired a route to Philadelphia by way of other lines, and the New York Central had its eyes on the West, just as the Pennsylvania did. To match the Commodore's railroad, the Pennsylvania took a page out of Vanderbilt's book and started acquiring smaller railroads with valuable connections. One of these rails was the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Rail, which itself was formed from 3 smaller, less successful railroads. The first of these was the Ohio and Pennsylvania, which was created in 1848 to link Pittsburgh and Crestline. Secondly, there was the Ohio and Indiana Railroad, which was chartered between 1850 and 1851 to continue westward from Crestline to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Finally, the Fort Wayne and Chicago was formed in 1852 to complete the link to Chicago. After several years of mixed independent construction and operation, they merged into one railroad in 1856. The other Western rail acquisition of note was the St. Louis, by way of the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis Railway. It was actually entirely created by the Pennsylvania Railroad, merged from 3 lesser railroads in the spring of 1868, emulating what the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago had done independently. The lesser railways in this case were the Pittsburgh and Steubenville, Steubenville and Indiana, as well as the Holliday's Cove Railroad. Similar to the Pennsylvania Railroad's previous acquisition, the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis shouldered the financial burdens of the lesser lines, even dipping into the Pennsylvania Railroad's budget to complete the merger. The first of these lesser railroads to be acquired was the Steubenville and Indiana Railway, which was chartered on February the 24th, 1848, to connect Steubenville, Ohio, along the Ohio River with the Indiana state line. The Pennsylvania bought stock in the railroad during the mid-1950s. Next, the Pennsylvania acquired the Pittsburgh and Steubenville Railroad, which was chartered on March the 24th, 1849, consisting of a line from Pittsburgh across the northern panhandle of what became West Virginia, ending at Steubenville. The last of these lines was the trickiest one to get a hold of. The Holliday's Cove Railroad was mandated by Congress, allowing Virginia to access the Pittsburgh and Steubenville through its northern panhandle. The state had been struggling against its construction due to the already established Baltimore and Ohio, which served a similar route near the city of Wheeling. All of this land currently lies in West Virginia, as this mandate predated the state, which was created after the split from the Confederate state of Virginia during the American Civil War on June the 20th, 1863. Nevertheless, the Holliday's Cove Railroad had to be constructed regardless, opening service from Pittsburgh to Columbus in 1865. And surprisingly, its only use was to construct a bridge across the Ohio River. After the Pennsylvania bought enough stock in the railroad, it merged it with the other 3 rails to create the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis Railway. It did not directly own this line, as it was technically still a subsidiary. Despite the merger, and perhaps due to not being directly owned by the Pennsylvania, the new railway struggled even after its creation. Yet despite the name, the Pennsylvania Railroad still didn't have access to St. Louis. It ended up buying out several other railways and making them subsidiaries to complete the route. The most noteworthy of these acquisitions was the Little Miami Railroad, incorporated on March the 11th, 1836, connecting Cincinnati with Columbus and Columbus, Chicago and Indiana Central, which opened service to Indianapolis, and another link to Chicago via Logansport, Indiana. The last connection to St. Louis was made through 2 other roads. These were the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad and the St. Louis, the Terre Haute and Vandalia. The former was originally chartered as the Terre Haute and Richmond, opening between Terre Haute and Indianapolis in 1851, but ultimately changing its name in March of 1865 to match the areas it accessed. The Pennsylvania Railroad leased the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad using the St. Louis, Vandalia, and Terre Haute subsidiary, directly purchasing it on August the 18th, 1893. Unlike the other routes, however, the completion of the St. Louis fell to the Vandalia line, a direct subsidiary entirely owned and operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad, running via Terre Haute, Vandalia, and Highland to East St. Louis. It opened in 1870, finally branching the Pennsylvania Railroad into the Midwestern United States. The final great extension took the Pennsylvania Railroad north into Michigan by way of the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. Chartered in 1854 and 1855, it ran from Fort Wayne, Indiana to the northern tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula at Mackinac City via Grand Rapids. The original hope for the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railway was that it would turn a profit, bringing the state's resources to other markets and operating car ferries across the Straits of Mackinac to connect the 2 peninsulas of Michigan, but the plan did not bear fruit. The railroad went bankrupt in 1869, and the Pennsylvania Railroad acquired most of its stock 4 years later, expanding the rails and integrating it into the system. It was the Pennsylvania Railroad's only presence in Michigan until, of course, 1922, when the Pennsylvania launched their Detroit line. This lack of presence in Michigan was one of the areas that New York Central was able to exploit, but the Pennsylvania Railroad still held a great deal of sway regardless. While the Pennsylvania Railroad had unmatched sway over its home state, it was not content with its lot on the eastern seaboard. The company spread south towards the nation's capital through the Northern Central Railroad, created in 1854 through the reorganization of the Buffalo and Susquehanna, a railroad that had existed since 1828. The Northern Central Railroad expanded to Sunbury in 1858, gradually expanding through central Pennsylvania into the 1900s. Though it should be pointed out that the Pennsylvania had significant stock as early as 1875 and full control by 1910. Next, the Pennsylvania looked north to New York, as the Port of New York was expanding rapidly to become the biggest on the East Coast. Since the New York Central Railroad's main draw was its link into the city, it was extremely important. Important enough that Thomson was personally involved with this effort. Expansion towards New York began in earnest after the Civil War. The first effort was the acquisition of the Philadelphia and Trenton and United Canals and Railroad Companies through leases in 1871. Again, the United Canal and Railroad Companies were made of several smaller canal and railroad systems, namely the Camden and Amboy, the New Jersey Railroad, the Belvedere and Delaware, the West Jersey Railroad, the Cape May and Millville, and the Delaware and Raritan Canal Company, and their service spread as far as Jersey City in New Jersey. In other words, coupled with the Pennsylvania Railroad's Exchange Place terminal on the New York City waterfront, their influence spread into New Jersey and was knocking at Vanderbilt's door. These lines came to be known as Pennsylvania Railroad's Northeast Corridor, eventually becoming a 4-track high-speed thoroughfare handling dozens of freight and passenger trains every day. However, the acquired rails only covered part of the Northeast Corridor. The southern end was constructed by the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, chartered on April 2, 1831, and largely completed in its final form by 1838. It was a deeply important route, important enough that the Pennsylvania Railroad had a significant influence battle with the Baltimore and Ohio over it, with the Pennsylvania winning in 1880. From there, it turned southwards, once again looking to run connections to Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. It gained influence over the Baltimore and Potomac Railroads in 1868, which connected Baltimore and Washington, D.C., creating a critical junction at the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. The charter required that any branch could not exceed 20 miles from the main line, so they got around this by locating the connection at Bowie, Maryland. The Pennsylvania Railroad also sent several more lines into the Delmarva Peninsula and across New Jersey, linking that state, Delaware, and Maryland deep into the Pennsylvania Railroad system. Now one could take a train from Philadelphia down to Atlantic City or to the beaches of Ocean City, Cape May, and Wildwood. All of these southerly railroads merged into the West Jersey and Seashore Railroad, which was heavily influenced by the Pennsylvania Railroad, but not formally leased until 1930. The final notable expansion of the Pennsylvania occurred in its home state after the 1860s, subsuming the Cumberland Valley Railroad, the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad, and the Western New York and Pennsylvania Railroad. Since New York Central had such a stronghold there, the Pennsylvania never gained significant traffic from Erie, but it did make enough business to make it worth the investment. Hence, once all of these routes had been brought together, the Pennsylvania, at its peak, had nearly 12,000 miles of tracks that consistently paid dividends thanks to their routing, high-quality structures, and constantly improving equipment, fuel and management practices, not to mention competitive approach. In fact, the closest opponent, the New York Central, carried only 3/4 of the amount of traffic that the Pennsylvania did. It had become the largest corporation in the world, arriving at the absolute highest point possible. Fortune magazine went as far as to describe it as, quote, a nation into itself. However, there was one final weakness of the railroad. It didn't have access to downtown Manhattan. That route was what made New York Central so special in the first place, and if the Pennsylvania Railroad was to fully beat its rival, it had to get a link. So after acquiring the Long Island Railroad for $6 million in 1900, the Pennsylvania launched a project for commuter service across New York, eventually culminating in the legendary Pennsylvania Station, fully opening for rail traffic on November the 27th, 1910. 2 years later, the Broadway Limited train opened, offering passenger transit in a hotly contested area. But unlike New York Central's 20th Century Limited, which was mainly defined by black and white colors, Broadway Limited featured soft and relaxing tones for the comfort of its passengers, partnered with the modern amenity of electrified rails. Railroads arrived at their absolute zenith in the 1930s, and in a way, there was nowhere left to go but down. In becoming the top of the food chain in transit, the Pennsylvania Railroad had made a lot of enemies. Most other railroads did not look at it fondly, especially when it started setting its rate so low that it began losing money on movements just to drive new business. Despite this, the Pennsylvania continued driving profits right up into the 1940s and through World War II. 1946 was the beginning of the end. That year was the first in its history that the railroad lost money overall. This trend continued into the 1950s, but the issues were overlooked as management was so used to things being good that they didn't react until things had gotten desperate, to the point that not even consolidating all of its holdings in 1950 into one Pennsylvania Railroad Corporation could undo the damage that was done. However badly the Pennsylvania was doing, other railroads were doing worse. Due to this, they began to explore the idea of a merger with New York Central in 1957, finally burying the hatchet after all those years. New York Central was very hesitant to do so, looking to instead merge with Chesapeake and Ohio or Baltimore and Ohio, but nothing bore fruit. They decided that merging with the Pennsylvania was the only option. Despite previously hassling the two railroads, the Interstate Commerce Commission approved the merger, and it was made official on February the 1st, 1968. The Pennsylvania Railroad was no more, as the Pennsylvania Central Transportation Company was born. However, this was also a disaster-ridden endeavor. Management teams clashed with one another in operation, and more bankrupt rails were forced upon it, despite struggling to stay afloat, burning through nearly $1 million a day towards the end. Just try to imagine that number, adjusted for inflation. Anyhow, after only 2 years of destitute, Penn Central officially declared bankruptcy on June the 21st, 1970, which spelled the end for the entire Northeast United States railroads. To avoid the entire region's economy shutting down, the government organized the Consolidating Rail Corporation, better known as Conrail, beginning on April the 1st, 1976. Tasked with managing freight transit on the rails, with the government at its back, Conrail was able to turn a dire situation around. And after finally turning a profit in 1981, CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern split the company in 1999, with Norfolk Southernly getting the majority of the Pennsylvania Railroad's former tracks. After the collapse of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the only remnants of its corporate structure were the insurance company, American Premier Underwriters, a company that only abandoned the name Penn Central Transportation Company for that name in 1994. It sued Amtrak to try and recover all the shares it had received as Penn Central that were transferred to Amtrak, but the case was dismissed in 2015. The Pennsylvania Railroad's shadow is still very visible throughout all of its former areas of operation. Despite the obvious, such as tracks that are still in use today, several trains traveling on these rails carry the colors and iconography of the Pennsylvania Railroad, in a way honoring the legacy of their ancestors. The tracks themselves are still being expanded today, as the government overseeing them sees to realize the value of the tracks that once formed what was the largest corporation in the world. In fact, as recently as December of 2023, over $100 million was dedicated to the expansion of passenger rail services, revitalizing one of the main facets of the Pennsylvania Railroad. While the Pennsylvania may have collapsed, perhaps there's a bright future in store for the railroads the company once ran upon. Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.